Today we are talking about Heartseeker, which received a complete overhaul in SMITE's most recent patch, essentially just making it a new item. We're going to break down Heartseeker's performance on various levels and against various enemies, so we can have a good overview of the new item from the time you can build it until late game, where you're facing tanks as well as not so tanky squishies. There's going to be quite a few numbers involved here, but before we get to that, let's quickly look at why the item was even changed. So Heartseeker's redesign is meant as a new late game option for junglers that allows them to perform better even if they didn't get the early game advantage. The stats of the item are now a price tag of 2,900 gold, so very much a late game item. 70 physical power, even though the tag currently says 75, it is actually 70 in game. 10 physical penetration, 200 mana and 20 MP5. The item also received a completely new passive, removing the old one. Your abilities deal an additional 3% of the target's maximum health as physical damage. If you have over 200 physical power, your ability bonus damage scales up. This effect reaches a maximum of 6% maximum health damage at 400 physical power. What's important to point out here is that despite this being percentage damage, it is not true damage. It's physical damage, and as such it's still affected by protections, and likewise those protections are still affected by penetration, so the damage here can be increased by building more penetration. My initial impression during the patch notes was that this item is not particularly great. However, many other people thought that it was very strong, so I wanted to look into it and find out in detail how good it really is at what point of the game, if it's more of an item that you can build in mid game already or in late game, and when it really has value for you. The items that I compare it to are your other main ability damage choices within the assassin items, being the Crusher and Brawler's Beatstick. Of course there are more items, but for example Jotun's Wrath simply will have less damage as it's more focused on CDR. The direct comparison here is more between Crusher and Heartseeker, as Brawlers will always have the anti-heal passive that means it is a bit weaker in the damage output, but Brawlers is to serve as a baseline here to understand how much damage output we would have without any additional effects. We're going to need a lot of stats here, so I'm going to go through them relatively quickly so we can get to the results. So first item with Crusher has a 30 power and 15 flat pen, plus a passive that gives it 20 extra base damage and 15% of your power when using an ability as a tick over 2 seconds. Additionally, it also has 20% attack speed, which is not relevant for the ability damage that we're testing here. Brawler's Beatstick comes with 40 power and 15 flat penetration. Heartseeker has 70 power, 10 flat penetration, and what I already mentioned, the 3 to 6% of the target's maximum HP as physical damage, plus the mana stuff, but that's also not really relevant for our damage output here. The first test level will be level 10. So level 10 we take an assassin that has Assassin's Blessing, which is fully stacked, as well as Warrior Tabi, and then one of the 3 items that I mentioned before. The target that we're going against here level 10 is going to be a ZiSotto, also level 10, 1195 HP and 43 physical protection. At this point the target doesn't matter as much just yet because everyone is much closer in HP and in defense, typically with the exception of the solo and support, which will have a bit more defense and a bit more health, but nothing that will have such a drastic impact as the ones that we'll get to later when we look at the actual tanks. So level 10 our stats are as follows: Crusher 70 power, 20 flat pen, Brawlers 80 power, 20 flat pen, and Heartseeker 110 power and 15 flat pen with the other items included. Now in order to put things into perspective, we also need an ability that has a base damage value as well as scaling. I looked at some damage values from Thor, from Susanoo, from Bastet, and what we can typically find, especially on those guards that have 4 damaging abilities, is that their base damage is around 300 for most abilities, sometimes more on one and less on the other, but it averages out around 300, and the scaling is somewhere around 90 to 100%. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to say the scaling is 100%, so we have 300 base damage and a scaling of 100% that we're going to work with here. With Crusher, this results in 370 true damage before the protections are factored in, an additional 31 from item effects. With Brawlers we get 380, and with Heartseeker we reach 410 plus an extra 36 from item effects. So what you can see is that even at this point Heartseeker does a little bit more damage than Crusher, but you also pay a fair bit more for this little bit of extra damage, and at the end of the day it is just 5 damage on the item effect, but the item itself gives you more damage as well due to the higher power. However, after factoring in protections and penetration, things are a little bit closer because both Crusher and Brawlers have 5 flat penetration more. In this case with Crusher we end up with 326 damage, with Brawlers it's 309, and with Heartseeker it's 348. So not an insane damage difference really, which will also be even out in other ways later, but we'll get to that. At this point we can say it doesn't seem to be worth investing into Heartseeker just yet, because Crusher offers you basically the same, almost at least, and the tiny bit of extra damage is probably not worth the price tag on Heartseeker here when you consider that in early game you get a lot of advantage out of being able to build the next item early and counter the enemy. So let's skip to level 20 when we have 4 full items plus Assassin's Blessing. I made the items here: Assassin's Blessing, Warrior Tabai, Hydra's Lament because it's something that you can usually fit in, and Brawler's Beatstick to have a pen item. Now I know that that results in one case in having 2 Brawler's Beatsticks, which is obviously not possible, but as that is just our baseline, it shouldn't affect the results in any negative way here. I wanted to opt for this because I wanted to have an item that has high power and also has high flat pen, because otherwise it would skew the results against Heartseeker, which doesn't have as much flat pen as the others. So in this case we'll try 3 different targets: a Hunter, an Assassin, and a Guardian. The Hunter has 1995 health and 66 physical protections. The Assassin has 2255 health and 87 physical protections. That is due to, for example, having built Magi's Blessing or having an aura or whatever. And then with the Guardian we have 2910 health and 179 physical protections, with Stone of Binding, Spirit Robe, Relic Dagger, Pridwin, and Gauntlet of Thebes, as well as your random choice of boots. Our total stats with Crusher right now are 150 power and 35 flat pen, with Brawlers it's 160 power and 35 flat pen, and with Heartseeker it's 190 power and 30 flat pen. Let's skip over the true damage base numbers here. If you're interested in those, you can just read them up here. What I want to compare real quick though is the difference in terms of damage with Heartseeker and with Crusher with the item effects. Crusher with this build with these 4 items will always have 43 damage through its ticks, whereas Heartseeker's damage against a Hunter is 60, against an Assassin is 68, and against a Guardian is 87, before we factoring in protections due to the difference in health on those targets. We have however not reached 200 power just yet, so Heartseeker will not get its additional percentage effect. We'll get to that at a later point. The outcome after factoring protections for a squishy Hunter is as follows. With Crusher we have 376 damage, with Brawlers we have 351 damage, and with Heartseeker we have 404. So 24 difference between Crusher and Heartseeker, and even Brawlers not that far behind, but it's a 50 damage difference between Brawlers and Heartseeker still, which is definitely worth factoring in when it comes to ability damage, because this is just 1 out of 3 or 4 abilities. With the Assassin, the damage of Crusher is 324, with Brawlers it's 303, and with Heartseeker it's 355. So we see a ever so slight increase in difference here in favor of Heartseeker due to the extra health. And against the Guardian, the damage with Crusher is 202, with Brawlers it's 189, and with Heartseeker it's 232. So again, a very slight increase in favor of Heartseeker here. In my opinion, nothing overwhelming so far, especially considering the price, but that's also depending on just how much you value this little bit of extra damage against tanks, or how much you even think that the extra damage against squishies can be worth it. Before we discuss that, a look a little bit deeper into late game. We're adding 2 further items to our build, Magi's Blessing and Bloodforge. We're trading out our Assassin's Blessing, leaving us with 5 high power items, really high power focused build really, and 1 defensive item. You could amp up the power a little bit more of course if you build Transcendence, but you rarely do that on Assassins in jungle really. The power here for Crusher would be 225 with 30 flat penetration. For Brawlers it's 235 with 30 flat penetration, and for Heartseeker it's now 265 power with 25 flat penetration. That means we are reaching over the 200 power cap and we actually get a little bit more percentage damage. The calculation here is relatively simple. At 200 power you have 3% health damage, and at 400 power you have 6%, meaning that 1% extra damage here needs you to have roughly 66.6 power over 200. And nicely enough, we have 265 here, so we can just round 1 extra percent on top of that and say we have 4% damage here, making it very easy for us. Against the Hunter, Crusher at this point deals 54 damage, while Heartseeker deals 80 damage. Against the Assassin, Crusher still 54, Heartseeker at 90. And against the Guardian, Crusher still 54, but Heartseeker now deals 116 damage, so the gap is definitely getting bigger here. But then again, we have to factor in protections. Against the Hunter, we deal 426 damage with Crusher, 393 with Brawlers, and 457 with Heartseeker. Against the Assassin, we deal 369 with Crushers, 341 with Brawlers, and 404 with Heartseeker. And last but not least, against our tank, we're dealing 232 with Crusher, 215 with Brawlers, and 268 with Heartseeker. That's gotta be enough numbers now. So what you can see here across the board is a relatively small gap. It's nothing huge, it's just, you know, around 30 damage more here and there, but nothing that's gonna completely blow your damage output as an assassin out of the water at any point. On these grounds, I find it relatively hard to justify the Heartseeker choice over the Crusher if we put them in direct comparison. And that's also for another reason, because Heartseeker doesn't come with additional DPS effects, while Crusher does. Crusher doesn't have quite as much direct damage output, but it has 20% attack speed, so most assassins will still use some basic attacks, and in that regard it's a massive DPS increase that will often outrank anything that you could do here with just abilities. Now Heartseeker is a bit favored in terms of damage output with basic attacks as well, because it has such high power, which works better for basic attacks compared to Pen, which works better for ability damage, because the base damage on basic attacks is lower. But that's something we'll talk about in another video, because that's a whole different can of worms. At the end, the point is that they're all pretty close. What Heartseeker is going for itself is that it's a meta counter with so many mages currently building into health items like Pythagorean's Piece, like Ethereal, and in that regard it can definitely help, but it's not overwhelmingly strong. It's not even close to concise in my opinion, which can just consistently shred health from enemies due to the fact that it lands with every single basic attack and it starts at the same value still. It still starts at 3%. It scales up a little lower to 5% instead of 6%, but it doesn't really matter because Heartseeker's value that you require to reach maximum 6% is way too high in my opinion. 400 physical power is something you can really only achieve if you only build into power and then get your pots and maybe have a guard that has some power increase or something. It's not something you realistically see in most games, because usually you will have to build at least some defense to survive, even if it's just Magi's Cloak. I also feel like we kind of lost something in old Heartseeker here, because that had some unique effect that most people of course didn't like, but at least on Nemesis it was really fun. I think the stat distribution on Heartseeker is a little bit strange. I think it would work much better if it had a little bit more flat penetration and a little less power, because it's kind of weird that you pay almost 3000 gold, but there are other items that are significantly cheaper that have more flat pen, and it's just so power heavy. But I guess at the same time, this way it's kind of designed to compete with Bloodforge, which you would usually build when you snowball at the moment, and it kind of fulfills a similar niche. It's less about killing many enemies in a row and more about just taking down the tankier ones as well. The question is if you want to do that as an assassin, but at the same time we can see that the overall damage output is still fine against squishies. It's just a bit weird how the passive is overall designed instead of just doing it like Kins where it goes against the enemy's health. The weird power scaling doesn't really make sense to me. Of course, as people are going to point this out, you can also build Crusher and Heartseeker together, and that will be relatively effective damage output because you get so much bonus damage. I just find that you often don't have the luxury to invest into 2 damage items of that type instead of going for Brawlers or just, like I said, more defensive options as well. But yeah, I see Heartseeker's value as a late game item, a conditional choice that can help you decently sometimes, and I think that is fair enough, even though I would still like some things about tweaked a little bit more. I might talk about this item on Hunters and on Warriors without any pen in the future, so stay tuned for that now that we already have the sheets for that. If you're new to the channel, feel free to hit the sub button and the bell, it really helps me out. And other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.